Hi, welcome to this little video. I'm going to discuss coronary artery bypass graft coating, otherwise known as CABGs. So when we are coding for a CABG, and that is CABG, otherwise it's not a vegetable, we're talking about coronary artery bypass grafts. So I think that's typically how people refer to these. Okay, so let's talk about CABG coding. CABG coding is not necessarily difficult. But you just kind of have to know where to look and how to use these codes and kind of how to add everything up. So I'm really just going to go over this relatively briefly. In our coding scenario here, it's pretty simple. We have patient undergoes a coronary artery bypass graft utilizing 3 arterial and 2 venous grafts. So let's talk about what a CABG is in the first place. I'm going to stop share my camera so that we can look at our book here. That's backwards. Okay, so there we are. So in our CPT code book, we find our cabbages, that they start on page 258. They go into page 259, 260, and 261. So I like this because we have some really great illustrations here. So what a CABG is essentially there's some sort of obstruction, atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis in the heart, right? And we're using a bypass to bypass that kind of clogged section, right? So you can see this section here. This is a single bypass. We're using 1 venous graft, and we are attaching it. We're attaching the coronary artery. Well, we're using this vein, right? It's a bypass. We're attaching it from the aorta, which has lots of great blood in it. We're bypassing this other area, which must be where that kind of obstruction is present, and we're attaching it down here. So it's bypassing that obstructed area to help improve blood flow. Okay, so that's a single venous graft. How do I know? Well, first of all, there's one of them, but also because it's blue. If you ever see in these anatomical illustrations, a blue vessel is always going to be non-oxygenated blood, otherwise known as a vein, right? So if we look at the one underneath, and again, on this, we're on page 259 in the CPT code book, in the 2024 CPT code book. So if we look at this one, this is a triple bypass. So if you've ever heard of someone doing a triple bypass, oh, my grandpa got a quadruple bypass, or whatever the case is, right? That's what that means. So a triple bypass is using 3 bypass grafts. So here we have an example of a triple bypass. This is a triple venous bypass, right? So we have 1, 2, 3 different venous grafts in this bypass procedure. If I flip the page and I look at page 260, so in order to perform these bypasses, they can use veins or arteries, right? And they can use either all veins, they could use all arteries, or they could use a combination of the two. So what we're looking at on page 260 is a combination procedure. Here we have 1 venous graft and 1 arterial graft, right? It's still a double bypass, and so you can tell this is an arterial graft because it's red, because it has oxygenated blood, right? Same thing down here. We have one vein and 1 artery. Okay, so when we're coding for CABGs, for CABG procedures, these are things that we have to identify, right? Are we using veins? Are we using arteries? And how many of each are we using? So I'm going to go back to my screen. I'm going to take some notes. Okay, so when we are talking about CABG coding, well, let me stop right there. You want to identify the vessels involved. Veins, vein, artery, or both. Okay, and then you also want to identify how many of each vessel type were used. So number of veins, number of arteries. There we go. Okay, so those are kind of the questions you want to ask yourself here. All right, so if we look at my scenario up here, right? Let's look how many excuse me, which vessels were involved, veins, arteries, or both. So here we have an arterial vessel, Also have a venous vessel. And then my next question is how many of each type were used? Okay, well, I have three arterial veins or arterial vessels used, and then two veins used. Okay, so I've got three arteries, two veins. All right, let's go from there. Now let's look at our codes. So I'm going to start sharing my camera again so that you can see my book. And it likes to go backwards, so I apologize for that. All right, so if we're looking at in our CPT code books on page 258, venous only grafts. So venous only, those procedures are going, so here we have venous grafting only for coronary artery bypass. So that's if all we used was veins. Code start at 33510 to 33516. Okay, and so if we look at our codes, it says coronary artery bypass vein only, single coronary artery graft. I'm sorry, venous graft. 33511 is 2, 512 is 3, 513 is 4, 514 is 5, and 516 is 6 or more, right? So they can get pretty involved in these grafting procedures. So that's venous only. Okay, now I'm going to flip the page and we're going to go to page 260 and look at this section, arterial grafting for coronary artery bypass. So I'm taking some notes for artery only. So this section is just arteries. If we look at our code, start 33533, that's coronary artery bypass using arterial grafts, single arterial graft. 33534 is two or more, or I'm sorry, two coronary artery grafts. 33535 is 3, 33536 is 4. And I think that's about it, right? So our code range is 33533 through 33536. Say that 10 times fast. Okay, so that's our artery only section. Now, what are we going to do if we have both veins and arteries? There's this little section in the middle. So here we have combined arterial venous grafting for coronary bypass. This is on page 259. Okay, and it starts off at 33517. You got coronary artery bypass using venous grafts and arterial grafts. The single vein graft lists separately in addition to the code for primary procedure. Okay, so let's check this code out for a minute. First of all, notice it's an add-on code. That means this cannot ever be used without the code that it must be added to. How do we know which code to add it to, right? So the code itself is saying coronary artery bypass. Okay, cool. Using venous grafts and arterial grafts. So isn't this the code we need? Not necessarily. So here's only identifying a single vein graft, and we need to list this separately in addition to the code for the primary procedure. And my camera is backwards. I apologize for that. Okay, so here it says again, list separately in addition to code for primary procedure, and then in parentheses underneath. So these are what we call parenthetical notations. So make sure you pay attention to your parenthetical notations. They're going to tell you how to use these codes, right? So in parentheses, it says use 33517 in conjunction with 33533 through 33536. So that's this section right here. These are our arterial grafting codes. And so that's kind of how you know which codes to use the add-on code with, right? So if I'm listing my combined grafting codes, it's 33517 through, and these ones function just like the other ones, right? This is a single vein plus two venous grafts plus three venous grafts, 4, 5, 33523 is 6 or more venous grafts. So it's 33517 through 33523. Okay, so I'm going to share my camera one more time. I'm sorry, I'm going to share my screen one more time so we can look at kind of the notes that I made here, right? So here in my coding scenario, we have three arteries, two veins. So you're going to identify one code. One code for the arterial grafts. and then one code for the venous grafts, right? So if we go back to our CPT code book in that artery only section, 33533 through 533536, we're going to identify the one that identifies 3 coronary arterial grafts, which is going to be 33535. Okay, that's going to be our arteries. I'm going to highlight it blue so we know which one we're talking about here. Okay. And now let's look at the code for the venous graft. The venous grafts are in this code range, 33510 through 33516. So I'm going to go to page 258 in my CPT code book and find the, 259 in my CPT code book and find the add-on code for this combined grafting that identifies 2 venous grafts, which is going to be 33518. Okay, so this is going to be how you would code a coronary artery bypass graft utilizing 3 arterial grafts and 2 venous grafts, 33535 and 33518. That add-on code. Now, there are more complexities when it comes to CABG coding in terms of how do they procure those vessels and where those vessels come from. Sometimes it's included, sometimes it's not. But at its very basic level, this is coronary artery bypass graft coding, which at least kind of gets us in that right section and shows you how these primary codes work.